Hussein is adorned with the title, the father of the free man. And the reason as to why he has been given this title is because of the immense sacrifice that he gave on behalf of all of mankind. For someone to give such a sacrifice, they must have full faith in that which they are doing and faith in that which they believe in. Faith comes after having been trialed and tested through that thing that you believe in. Faith comes from having been struck and shaken in accordance with your own beliefs. And when there was an opportunity to walk away from the battlefield with his family, with his life held intact, Hussein entered that battlefield in order to demonstrate that he had faith in the message of being the father of the free man. And therefore Hussein demonstrated to all of us the value of not just having faith from the tongue, not just from the heart, but embodying the action of faith in everything that you have. And therefore this leaves questions for us in the world in which we live in. What do I have faith in today? And what am I willing to do in order to demonstrate that faith today in the 21st century?
What is so inspiring is that Hussein was all by himself, surrounded by thousands of enemy combatants. And then all of a sudden he noticed that his family members were being attacked from different directions. He made out a cry that reverberates throughout centuries and actually inspires and awakens the conscience of so many. He said, "Be free in this world." And Hussein's ethos was about establishing freedom and promoting human rights and standing against injustice and oppression. Now, for a man who noticed that there was widespread cancerous dictatorship and oppression that was very much strife at that time, he stood to correct it. He stood to eliminate any type of hypocrisy that existed at that time. And therefore, he stands as an embodiment of those who are seeking to establish freedom and the expression, right to express oneself at all times, at all centuries. Human beings are generally craving to practice their faith and to be given the freedom to express themselves. And for millions across the world today, Hussein stands as the exemplary individuals and the role model in seeking to establish freedom, dignity, honor, and the right for self-expression.
Hussein grew up in a household that was colorblind. One of the maids in the house was actually of African descent, but the way in which she was treated was as if she was a member of the family. The Umayyads, who were the ruling dynasty at that particular time, were quite prejudiced in the way in which they dealt with non-Arabs. Even amongst the Arabs themselves, there was a class system. Hussein, when he rose in Karbala, actually rose to rectify some of these ills of society, as he stated that he was rising to reform the community of his grandfather and enjoin good and forbid evil. We see that when John actually went into battle and fought and was eventually martyred, Hussein actually came to the dead body of John, and he did something which the Arabs at the time couldn't really understand. He dismounted and lay down next to John and placed his cheek alongside the cheek of John, this martyred African freed slave. And this is something that he actually did with his own son when he passed away or was martyred on the plains of Karbala as well. This shows that Hussein was trying to tell the world that there was really no difference between a freed slave who was from African descent and his own son who was an Arab. While in this day and age, this gesture of Hussein makes sense for the 7th century Arabs, many of whom were still very racist, it didn't. And even though he was just minutes away from his own demise, his own death, he still found the time to make a very important gesture like this, which resonates till today.
Here was Hussein with only 72 followers facing an army of 30,000. Right away, a person, a normal person, would want to back down from something like that. But Hussien maintained his ground and went all the way in his opposition. The other one is lack of support. There are many activities that we would like to do that we depend upon support for doing it, or we want support for doing it. We see Hussein's support base whittling away in front of his very eyes. And even though he had options in terms of withdrawing from the fight, we see that he continued pressing on in moving towards his goal. So we can learn from Hussien. We can learn from Hussien in the fact that we have to maintain our determination with whatever goals that we set.
One of the interesting things about Hussein's peaceful stand in Karbala, Iraq, was that essentially it was a human rights issue. It first of all showed his own courage in standing up for values of justice, which is always eternally relevant, but also it shows the kind of things that he was denied, basic dignity, which I'll go into, which I think is again a very important thing to reflect on. First of all, Hussien basically said that I'm here to stand up for justice against a corrupt ruler. I mean, that shows great courage, but he did that in a very peaceful way. For example, he never forced anybody to join his movement, number one. Number two, even the night before, in fact, he was martyred, known as the night of Ashura, he actually told his own members of his camp that, look, you can leave if you want, no problem. It's about believing in this movement of justice. And that again shows the mark of a very courageous and noble man. At the end of the spectrum, however, you find that today when we talk about human rights and everybody has a human dignity or right to fair trial or right to free speech, Hussien was basically denied these things. So for example, Article 10 of the UDHR, Universal Declaration of Human Rights, actually says that everybody has a right to fair trial. Hussien was even denied expressing his views in a natural court. Article 18 states that everybody has a right of freedom of religion, conscience and thought. Hussien could not even express his views naturally and say, this is the kind of religion that I believe in. And finally, Article 20 of the UDHR states that everybody has a right of freedom of association and assembly. And again, Hussien was denied that. For when he did try to very peacefully try to spread his message, some of his own companions were beheaded. It is for this reason that I think, just as human beings commemorate World War I, World War II and the Holocaust, I do feel that Karbala stands up there as a very important world event.
1400 years ago, a man called Hussien stood at crossroads. He had arrived at the plains of Karbala in Iraq, faced with a stark choice, as many of us are faced with in our lives. He was faced with tyranny and injustice, and he had a choice to make. He could have walked away with his life intact and his family, but he decided to make a stand, a selfless stand. It was not for him that he stood to be counted. It was for humanity at large. It was to stand up against injustice of his day. The selflessness of Hussien is a lesson for all of us, for all of humanity. Many, many times in our lives, we come across situations where we know we should make a stand, we know we should say something, but perhaps we're apathetic, perhaps we feel it'll be too much of a chore, and we decide to look the other way, because at this point in time, it's not about us. Meanwhile, people suffer. The question is, can we learn from Hussien the secret of selflessness? What will you do the next time you are faced with the same crossroads that Hussien? Will you walk away, or will you decide to make a stand? The choice is yours.
Throughout his life, Imam Hussien demonstrated his absolute belief in the inherent nobility, dignity, and equality of all human beings, regardless of their racial or ethnic origin, how society viewed them, whether society viewed them as slaves or as free people, whether they were rich or whether they were poor, or even regardless of what religion they adhered to. And this was in direct contrast to the tyrants that Imam Hussien was standing against. These tyrannical rulers wished to consolidate a society based on social stratification, enriching an elite at the expense of the poor, and having their society only for people from one lineage or one ethnicity. And thus we see that among the companions of Imam Hussien, there were people from a vast variety of backgrounds. Many people joined him because they saw that his cause was rightful. And so, for example, Imam Hussien had companions from as far away as Turkey and the Caucasus and even Africa. Among the companions of Imam Hussien were women and men, the rich and the poor, and even people of different religious backgrounds who had joined the Imam when they had seen what he was standing for. And so today, the name of Imam Hussien continues to be held up as a flag of human equality and dignity. And those people who are standing up for these causes remember the name of Imam Hussien.
Imagine the situation. Hussien and his companions leave Mecca with the women and the children of their community, and they're heading toward Karbala, where the final battle will take place. All the way they are shepherded along by a squadron of soldiers under the leadership of a man called Al-Hur. They guide them, they force them in a certain direction. They're not allowed to turn back. One day they actually ride into the camp of Hussien, and Hussien notices that the men and their horses are in need of water. They're dry and thirsty. And so he shares his water with them. Imagine water in the desert. How important is that? He shares his water with them in an act of kindness and generosity. Some days later, we come to the field of battle itself. Al-Hur is arranged with the enemy about to commence battle against Hussien. Al-Hur's heart is moved by the kindness and generosity of Hussien, and so he breaks ranks, he rides down into the camp, throws himself on the ground at the feet of Hussien and says, "I'm the man who brought you here. I'm the man who brought you to death on this field of battle. Please forgive me." Hussien reaches his hand down to him. He raises him to his feet. He restores him to human dignity, gives him forgiveness, and then Al-Hur takes up his arms and fights together with Hussien, because here was a man who was touched by the qualities of Hussien, his kindness, his noble spirit, his generosity, his compassion, and he saw his own self and sought forgiveness.